The car had been moving for 11 minutes before Grant Calloway felt his stomach drop. It wasn't the motion. It was the billboard. He'd been mid-sentence, phone pressed to his ear, closing the largest acquisition of his career, feeling the particular bulletproof confidence that comes from a decade of being right about most things that mattered. The SUV slowed for a red light at the corner of 5th and Delancey, and he glanced up out of habit, the way a man checks his reflection in a passing window without meaning to. Then he stopped breathing. 40 feet tall, lit against the gray morning sky, a woman stood in a black suit with her hair pulled back so severely it looked less like a style and more like a decision. Her expression was calm in a way that seemed to reach through the glass and settle directly on him, though he knew, even in that first disoriented second, that this was impossible. Billboards didn't look at anyone. They simply waited to be seen. Underneath her face, block letters glowed, white against the dark background. Noelle Ashby, founder, chairwoman, visionary, and beneath that, smaller, quieter, and somehow louder than anything else on the sign, Ashby Group completes acquisition of Calloway Industries. The voice on the other end of the phone kept talking. Something about percentages, something about a press release schedule for Thursday, but it had become the sound of a television left on in another room. Grant was looking at a woman he had last seen 5 years earlier, carrying a single suitcase out of a house he had told her, more than once, she didn't deserve to keep. He had told everyone she left because she couldn't cope. He had told his mother she'd gone quietly because some deep, honest part of her understood she had never really earned any of it. He had told himself, for 5 years, in the particular way men tell themselves stories that let them sleep at night, that Noelle Ashby had disappeared into some small, forgettable life, because that was where women like her ended up when the marriage that made them visible was finally over. Now her face owned 40 feet of Fifth Avenue, and her company, according to letters that did not lie the way people did, now owned him. Who is that? Priya's voice came from the seat beside him, sharp with the particular practiced suspicion of a woman who has learned to read her husband's face for the exact moment it stops belonging to her. Grant didn't answer. He couldn't. His hand had gone cold around the phone, and beneath the shock, something colder was already assembling itself into a thought he would spend the rest of the day trying to outrun. If she owns enough of my shares to put her name on that building, she owns enough of my shares to end me. The light turned green. The car eased forward, and the billboard slid backward in the side mirror. But Noelle's face stayed exactly where it had landed, behind his eyes, patient, unbothered, wearing the same expression she'd worn the day he signed the papers that ended their marriage. The look of a woman who already knew something he hadn't caught up to yet. He didn't know it then, but he was about to spend the next several weeks discovering exactly how long she'd known it, and exactly how much of his own life had been quietly built on top of hers without his ever noticing the foundation. If a story like this one keeps you wondering what you would have done in her place, go ahead and hit subscribe before we go any further, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. 5 years earlier, in a lawyer's office with too much beige carpet and not nearly enough air, Noelle Ashby sat with her hands folded in her lap while her husband explained, calmly, almost kindly, which somehow made it worse, that their marriage had run its course. You always wanted a life you didn't know how to build, Grant told her, sliding the settlement papers across the table the way a man slides a tip across a counter, as though the gesture itself was generous. I gave you one anyway. I think that should count for something. Noelle didn't answer right away. She looked down at the papers, at his handwriting already filling in his portion of the signature lines, confident even in the shape of his letters. Then she looked up at him, at the man she had once watched cry from exhaustion at their kitchen table at 2 a.m, back when he still needed her enough to let her see him unguarded. There was a version of this moment where she stood up and told him everything. The 11 years of invisible work, the deals she'd steered from rooms he never entered, the money that had quietly kept his company alive during the worst months of his career. There was a version where she made him understand, in that instant, exactly what he was losing. She didn't choose that version. Not yet. She understood something about timing that Grant had never had to learn, because nothing in his life had ever required him to wait. Beside him sat his mother, Constance Calloway, a woman who had spent 11 years treating Noelle as a temporary arrangement rather than a daughter-in-law, the kind of presence you tolerated at holidays rather than someone you built a family around. Constance leaned forward now, not unkindly, in the particular way people lean forward when they believe they are being generous. "At least leave with some dignity," Constance said. Noelle looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in her expression, which unsettled Constance more than anger would have. Then Noelle picked up the pen, and she signed. No begging, no last appeal, no mention of 11 years spent building the scaffolding beneath a company that carried only her husband's name. She took one suitcase from the house on Ambrose Lane, a house where her handwriting was still visible on moving boxes stacked in the garage from the day they'd bought it, and she did not look back at the windows as she walked to the car waiting outside. Grant watched her go, standing in the doorway with the particular satisfaction of a man who has never once had to consider another person's interior life and believed, in that moment, that he had no idea what she was walking toward. He had no idea that the woman climbing into that car was not disappearing at all. She was simply going somewhere he had never thought to look. To understand why Noelle Ashby let her marriage end without a single fight, you have to go back further to a version of Grant Calloway that almost nobody remembered anymore, and a version of Noelle that almost nobody had ever really been allowed to see. They met when he was 26 and broke in the specific, hungry way ambitious young men are broke. Expensive taste financed by borrowed confidence. A business plan held together with duct tape and charm. Noelle was 24, sharper than she let herself appear, with a habit of asking the one question in any room that made everyone else's comfortable assumptions quietly collapse. In those early years, before the money came and rearranged everything, Grant genuinely admired her. He told people so at dinners, at the small gatherings of other struggling entrepreneurs where everyone was still hungry enough to be honest. She helped him organize his first company out of chaos, built the systems that let it survive its first 2 winters, negotiated quietly with vendors who wouldn't return his calls, but always returned hers because she never once raised her voice and never once needed to. There's a particular kind of photograph from that era that Noelle still kept, tucked into a drawer she rarely opened. Grant at 28, exhausted, grinning, his arms slung around her shoulders outside their first real office. 400 square feet above a dry cleaner, no air conditioning, a single fax machine they bought secondhand. In the photograph, he is looking at her like she is the reason any of it is possible. It would be almost 6 years before he stopped looking at her that way, and by the time she noticed the shift that happened, she couldn't remember the exact day it had started. Success changes the weather inside a marriage slowly, the way a house settles. You don't notice the crack in the foundation until you're standing in a room that no longer feels quite level. Somewhere around year 6, at a dinner with investors in a private room at a hotel Noelle had chosen, because she knew the sommelier and could guarantee good service, she heard her husband introduce her, for the first time, as "my wife. She doesn't work," and felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. She worked constantly. She simply worked in rooms he never entered. Because by then, Noelle had already begun building something of her own. Something small, unregistered under any name that could be traced back to her, invisible to a world that only knew her as Grant Calloway's wife. The woman who organized his galas and smiled correctly for photographs and never once corrected a reporter who described her as supportive. Late nights at the kitchen table after Grant had gone to sleep. Encrypted files backed up to a drive she kept in a safety deposit box under her maiden name. Careful, patient investments made through a holding company with a name that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Thistledown Capital, named for the plant that grows in the cracks of sidewalks nobody thinks to check. The only person who knew the full shape of what she was building was a quiet, meticulous man named Theo Reyes, a financial strategist she'd found through a mutual contact and paid in cash for the first 2 years, because she couldn't risk a paper trail that led back to her husband's accountants, who reviewed every account with her name on it as a matter of routine. One day, Theo told her once, over black coffee in a diner 3 towns away from where she lived, in a booth by the window where they could watch the parking lot instead of each other, You're going to have to stop hiding this." "I'm not hiding," Noelle said, turning her cup slowly on its saucer. "I'm protecting it." He didn't ask what it was. Not yet. It would be years before he understood that she wasn't only protecting money. She was protecting proof of exactly who had built what in a marriage where credit had only ever flowed in one direction. The betrayal, when it came, arrived in two forms. One loud enough for the tabloids to feast on for a full news cycle, and one quiet enough that only Noelle ever noticed it happening at all. The loud one was Priya Lindqvist, a rising publicist 11 years younger than Noelle, hired to manage Calloway Industries' image during a difficult acquisition season that had left the company's reputation more fragile than its balance sheet. Grant's affair with her was, in retrospect, almost predictable, the kind of thing everyone in the office seemed to see coming except, apparently, his own wife, who was too busy running a company he didn't know existed and noticed the late nights that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. But the quiet betrayal was worse, and it happened in a boardroom Noelle never once sat in. Calloway Industries nearly collapsed the year before the divorce. A supplier lawsuit that dragged on for months, a bad expansion into a market that hadn't been ready for them, a credit line pulled without warning by a bank that had grown nervous about the company's exposure. Grant spent 3 sleepless weeks convinced he was about to lose everything he'd spent a decade building. Until, almost overnight, a private investment group stepped in and stabilized the company with a capital infusion large enough to make the difference between survival and bankruptcy. Grant never learned the investor's name. The deal came through 3 layers of holding companies specifically structured to keep it that way, a level of caution that his own lawyers found unusual, but not, in the relief of the moment, worth questioning too closely. He simply knew that the money arrived, that the company survived, and that 6 months later he was standing in front of a room full of journalists, cameras flashing, saying the words that would come to define the next 5 years of his public life. "I built this from nothing. Every dollar of it." Noelle watched that interview from the guest room of the house on Ambrose Lane, a room she had started sleeping in months earlier without either of them ever discussing why. The silence between them by then so complete it had become its own kind of language. She watched her husband take full, public credit for a rescue her own company had quietly engineered, funded with money she had spent a decade building without his knowledge, and she said nothing. Not because she was weak, because by then she had already stopped needing him to know. The divorce, when it finally came, was framed for public consumption exactly the way Constance Calloway wanted it framed, a wife who had grown distant, ungrateful, unable to keep pace with her husband's rising success. Nobody printed the truth because nobody knew it. The tabloids ran a photograph of Noelle leaving the courthouse looking, according to one particularly unkind headline, worn down by a marriage she couldn't keep up with. Priya Lindqvist moved into the house on Ambrose Lane within the year, sleeping in a bedroom Noelle had painted herself, the color chosen from a swatch she'd carried in her purse for 3 weeks before deciding. There was only one moment in the entire proceeding that struck Grant as strange, though he was too satisfied with the outcome to examine it closely at the time. "Why aren't you fighting harder for the company?" he asked her, almost curious, the day before the papers were finalized, as though her calm was a puzzle rather than a decision. Noelle looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, one that would return to him, unbidden, 5 years later, standing beneath a billboard on Fifth Avenue. "Because it was never mine," she said. Grant smiled. He took it as surrender. It wasn't surrender. It was the truest sentence she'd said to him in years, and he would not understand, for a very long time, that she meant it in exactly the opposite way he assumed. What followed has to be told the way it actually happened. Not as a single dramatic transformation, but as 5 quiet years, each one built carefully on top of the last, brick by patient brick, the way her grandmother had once taught her to reinforce a hem so the repair became stronger than the original seam. In the first year, Noelle went home. Not to a rebound relationship, not to a rented apartment in a city where no one would recognize her, but to a small town 3 states away, to the workshop behind the house where her grandmother, Odessa Ashby, had raised her after Noelle's own parents proved unreliable in ways nobody in the family discussed above a whisper. Odessa had spent nearly 40 years altering wedding dresses and mending church clothes for people who couldn't always pay full price, taking eggs and garden vegetables in trade when cash was short, teaching a young Noelle that a business could be built on patience and precision even when it looked, from the outside, like it was barely surviving. Noelle swept 5 years of dust out of that workshop with her own hands. She found, in a drawer beneath the old sewing table, a coffee tin full of buttons sorted by size, and a length of deep blue fabric her grandmother had never finished turning into anything, folded neatly, waiting. She hung the fabric on the wall rather than putting it away, though she couldn't have said why at the time. For the first time in over a decade, sitting alone in that quiet, dust-lit room, nobody needed anything from her at all. It was the loneliest and most peaceful year of her life, and she would later say it was the year she finally learned the difference between the two. In the second year, using capital she had grown for nearly a decade without her husband's knowledge, capital that had once helped save his own company without his ever knowing whose hand had reached out to catch him, Noelle quietly purchased a struggling textile mill 2 counties over, the kind of business everyone in the region assumed was already circling the drain. She didn't gut it for parts. She rebuilt it slowly, retraining half the existing workforce, investing in machinery that let them compete with overseas manufacturers on quality rather than price. Locals called it a miracle. Noelle called it math, plus patience, plus a refusal to solve every problem the way Grant would have solved it, by simply spending money until the problem went away. In the third year came a logistics company on the edge of bankruptcy. Its founder, an exhausted man named Desmond Okafor, who had spent 18 months trying to keep 40 employees on payroll through a downturn that wasn't his fault. Noelle's investment, arranged through Theo and 3 layers of holding structures, kept every one of those 40 jobs intact. Desmond never learned who had saved his company. Not yet. In the fourth year, a failing technology firm nobody in the industry had bothered to notice, run by 2 engineers with a good idea and no ability to sell it to anyone with real capital. Noelle didn't just fund them. She sat with them for 2 full days, unpaid, restructuring their pitch, teaching them the language investors needed to hear, the same language nobody had ever bothered to teach her, back when she was the one nobody thought to fund. By the 5th year, Ashby Group, a name almost no one outside a narrow circle of institutional investors had ever heard, was quietly acquiring meaningful positions in companies far larger than anything Noelle had ever been permitted to touch during her marriage, when every decision, no matter how sound, had required Grant's signature and Grant's approval and, eventually, Grant's public credit. Every time, her name stayed off the paperwork that mattered most. Every deal ran through Theo Reyes, through layers of structures deliberately designed to maintain the kind of invisibility that takes both real money and real discipline to sustain over years rather than months. Why do you still keep your name out of it? Theo asked her once, watching her review the term sheet worth more, on paper, than the entire net worth of the man who had once introduced her to a room full of investors as someone who didn't work. Noelle set down her pen and looked out the workshop window, where the length of blue fabric her grandmother never finished still hung on the wall like an unanswered question she wasn't ready to answer either. Because I spent 11 years being loved for what people assumed I was, she said. I needed to find out who I actually was, once nobody was assuming anything about me at all. That was the sentence Theo never repeated to anyone, not even in the years that followed, when half the financial press in the country would have paid a great deal of money to hear it. It was also the truest thing she ever told him, truer, in its way, than anything she'd said in 11 years of marriage. If you've made it this far, I have to ask, has a story like this one ever hit closer to home than you expected it to? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them, and some of the richest details and stories like this one come straight from people just like you. There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a single devastating night. It arrives as a Tuesday that feels exactly like the Tuesday before it, and the one before that, until a year has passed and you realize you have built an entire life around the absence of something you used to have. Noelle knew this loneliness intimately during that first year. and she never once let herself pretend otherwise, even as the mill turned its first profit, even as the logistics deal closed clean. There were evenings in the workshop when the light faded early and she sat with a cup of tea gone cold, listening to the particular silence of a house that had once, decades earlier, held her grandmother's voice singing off-key to the radio while she worked the old machine. And Noelle let herself miss things, the sound of Grant's key in the door on the good years, before it curdled. The version of herself who still believed being useful and being loved were the same thing. She did not call anyone during those evenings. She did not reach for the phone. She let the loneliness sit in the room with her, the way her grandmother had taught her to sit with an unfinished seam rather than rushing it, because rushed work always showed, eventually, in the stitching. It was during the second year that Marisol Chun first walked into the workshop. 17 years old then, sharp-eyed, arms crossed, sent by a school counselor who'd run out of ideas for a girl too smart for her circumstances and too proud to admit she needed help. Marisol expected charity and was prepared to reject it. What she found instead was a woman who put a stack of invoices in front of her within the first 10 minutes and asked her to find the error in the math. Marisol found it in 90 seconds. Noelle hired her on the spot, not as a favor, but because the girl was genuinely, unmistakably good at something the world hadn't yet bothered to notice. The exact position Noelle herself had occupied for most of her adult life. Their relationship, in those early months, was built on precisely the kind of dry, undramatic competence that neither of them had much practice receiving from anyone else. Marisol didn't ask about the framed absence of a wedding photograph, or the way Noelle sometimes went quiet mid-sentence when a certain kind of successful man's name came up in the news. Noelle didn't ask about the father Marisol never mentioned, or the reason a 17-year-old was already this careful about which adults she let herself trust. They simply worked side by side, and trust accumulated the way Noelle's fortune had, quietly, in small increments, until one day it was simply undeniably there. Back in the present, Grant sat in his office on the 41st floor with the blinds drawn, staring at a folder his assistant had placed on his desk with visibly unsteady hands. He had ordered the investigation the moment the SUV pulled away from that intersection, needing to know precisely who was behind Ashby Group, how deep their position in Calloway Industries actually ran, and, more urgently than either of those things, how long they had been quietly buying without his knowledge. The answer, when it finally arrived, took his legs out from under him. Ashby Group had been acquiring shares in Calloway Industries for 11 months, slowly, patiently, through subsidiaries structured with a level of care that his own general counsel hadn't flagged as a coordinated pattern until it was far too late to intervene. They now held enough voting power to influence the board on any matter they chose to raise. Who runs it? Grant asked, his voice tighter than he wanted it to be. Who's actually behind the fund? His assistant hesitated a beat too long before sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. One photograph, one name typed beneath it, in the plain, unadorned font of a corporate filing that had no idea it was about to detonate a man's entire understanding of the last 5 years of his life. Grant looked down at the face that had watched him from a billboard that same morning, and for the second time that day, he stopped breathing entirely. His phone buzzed against the desk. An email notification, subject line blank, sender listed simply as in, Ashby, chairwoman. He opened it with hands that were no longer entirely steady, the way his hands used to shake in the earliest days of the company, before he'd convinced himself and everyone else that he'd never once been afraid of anything. The message was 3 lines long. Emergency board meeting. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Your presence is required, not optional. You want to be there for this one, Grant. I know you have questions. I have answers. He read it twice. Then he set the phone down very slowly and sat in the silence of his own office for a long time, trying to understand how the woman he had once described to a room full of investors as someone who didn't work had ended up holding his entire company in the palm of her hand, and dreading, more than he had dreaded anything in 5 years, whatever she was about to say to him in that boardroom. Because if Noelle Ashby had spent 5 quiet years building this without his ever noticing, what else had she been building all those years before, that he still had no idea he'd been standing on. Priya found him still sitting there an hour later, jacket still on, tie loosened, the blinds drawn against the city he'd once believed belonged to him. She didn't ask what the folder said. She'd learned, over the years, not to ask Grant questions during the moments he looked most like a man who had already lost. "You're scared of her," Priya said instead, and it wasn't a question either. Grant didn't answer right away. Outside, the city had gone from gray to gold as the afternoon light shifted, indifferent to the particular unraveling happening on the 41st floor. "I'm not scared of her," he said finally, though even he could hear how little conviction the words carried. "I just don't understand her. I never did." Priya considered that for a long moment, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, and something in her expression suggested she was beginning to understand a great deal more than her husband realized. "Maybe," she said quietly, "that was always the problem." She left him alone after that, and Grant sat by himself until the office had gone fully dark around him, staring at a photograph of a woman he had spent 5 years believing he understood completely and beginning for the first time to suspect he never had. The boardroom doors were heavier than Grant remembered. He had walked through them 1,000 times, for celebrations, for crises, for the quarterly meetings that used to bore him, because nothing in this room had ever once gone against him. Today his hand hesitated on the brass handle for a full 3 seconds before he pushed it open, and the sound of his own footsteps on the marble felt unfamiliar, like he was entering a building he no longer had any claim to. Which, as of 11 months of quiet acquisitions he'd never noticed happening beneath him, he technically didn't. He had spent the previous night rehearsing versions of this moment. A version where he arrived with his own lawyers flanking him like a small army. A version where he simply refused to show up at all and let the board wonder what he was hiding. In the end, he came alone, because some instinct he didn't fully trust told him that showing up with an army would only prove how frightened he was. He expected a wall of Ashby Group representatives in gray suits, spreadsheets stacked like ammunition, a firing squad of accountants ready to walk him through the mechanics of his own defeat in language cold enough to feel clinical. Instead, the room was almost empty. Theo Reyes sat near the window, silent, a single leather folder closed on the table in front of him, his expression giving away nothing. And at the head of the table, Grant's table, in Grant's chair, the seat he had occupied at every board meeting for 15 years, sat Noelle. She looked exactly like the billboard. Calm, unhurried, a woman who had plainly stopped needing to prove anything at all to the room she was sitting in, because she had already proven it, years ago, to the only person whose opinion had ever really mattered to her, herself. The word came out of Grant before he could stop it, raw and disbelieving, echoing slightly off the marble. "Good morning, Grant." Her voice was even, neither cold nor warm, simply steady in a way that unsettled him far more than open hostility would have. Hostility, at least, he knew how to negotiate with. He remained standing, because sitting felt like conceding something he wasn't prepared to concede yet. "What did you do?" Noelle folded her hands on the table, the gesture unhurried, almost gentle. "I built." 2 words. He waited for more, and for a long moment she let the silence stretch between them. Let him sit inside it the way she had once sat inside so many silences of her own, back when speaking honestly wasn't yet safe. 11 years ago, she finally said, "You told a room full of investors that your wife didn't work. Do you remember that?" Grant's jaw tightened, the muscle visibly working beneath his skin. "Noelle, I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking if you remember." She didn't wait for an answer, because she already knew he did. Men like Grant remembered every room they'd ever commanded, even the ones where they'd said something they would come to regret. "I remember. I remember it precisely, because it was the night I decided you would never again get to define what I was worth. Not to anyone else, and, eventually, not even to me." She opened the folder in front of her, not dramatically, simply the way anyone opens a folder they have been waiting a very long time to open, patient enough now that the waiting itself had become part of the satisfaction. 3 years into our marriage, you nearly lost everything," she said. "A supplier lawsuit, a pulled credit line, 3 weeks where you didn't sleep because you were certain Calloway Industries was finished. You told me, at the time, that you'd never been more afraid in your life. She turned a page, the sound of it unnaturally loud in the quiet room. An anonymous investment group stabilized you almost overnight. You never learned who they were. I did. I was there, Grant. It was mine. Grant's face had gone the color of the marble beneath his feet. That's not. The timing doesn't add up. The structure of that deal came through. 3 holding companies, 2 of which no longer exist, one of which still files under a name that means nothing unless you know exactly what you're looking for, Theo said quietly from the window, sliding the leather folder across the table without looking up from it. Every transaction, every wire, every date stamped and notarized. It's all documented, Mr. Calloway, in far more detail than you'll want to sit through this morning. Grant didn't touch the folder. He was still staring at Noelle like a man, trying to solve an equation that kept rearranging itself every time he thought he'd found the answer. 6 months later, Noelle continued, her voice steady, almost gentle, which made it worse. You stood in front of a room of journalists and told them you built this company from nothing. Every dollar of it, I believe, were your exact words. Her expression didn't change, but something underneath her voice sharpened, just slightly, like a blade catching unexpected light. I financed the expansion that made you a name people recognized outside the city. My network financed 2 of the 3 acquisitions you took full public credit for in your last shareholder letter. The one where you thanked and, I quote, my own instincts and nothing else for the company's growth. You have spent 5 years being celebrated as a self-made man, standing on infrastructure I built while you were telling rooms full of people that I didn't work. Why? Grant said, and his voice cracked on the single word in a way it hadn't cracked in front of another human being in longer than he could remember. He finally sat, because his legs had stopped feeling entirely reliable beneath him. Why didn't you just tell me? Any of it. At any point in 11 years. Why didn't you just say something? Because you never asked, Noelle said simply. Not once in 11 years of marriage did you ask me what I did with my days beyond the calendar you'd already assigned me. You assumed. That was always the problem, Grant. You built an entire empire on assumptions about the market, about your competitors, about me. And I let you, for longer than I should have, because I was still learning what I was capable of, and I needed a place to learn it where you weren't paying close enough attention to take credit for that too. So this is revenge. He said it like an accusation, grasping for solid ground the way a drowning man grasps for anything at all. You waited 5 years to humiliate me in front of my own board, in a room where I built everything I have. Something flickered across Noelle's face at that. Not hurt, exactly, but something adjacent to it, quickly folded away and put back in its place. If I wanted revenge, she said, and her voice, for the first time, carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. I would have taken everything from you 5 years ago, the week the divorce was finalized, when I already held enough leverage to end you completely and you didn't even know I existed as anything more than a name on a settlement agreement you were eager to sign. I didn't do that, Grant. I could have. I chose not to. Then what is this? This is a shareholder exercising her legal rights. Noelle's voice hardened, the warmth in it receding entirely, replaced by something colder and far more precise. Ashby Group is formally calling for a vote of no confidence in your leadership on grounds of financial mismanagement over the last 18 months. The unauthorized expansion into the Denholm acquisition that you pushed through without full board disclosure, the undisclosed liabilities buried in the Greer textile purchase, and the falsified growth projections you personally presented to this board in March. Projections that 3 independent auditors have since confirmed do not match the underlying data. Every item is documented, cross-referenced, and notarized. Theo has prepared the complete materials for distribution to the full board this afternoon. Grant stared at her, and for the first time since the billboard that morning, real fear moved through him. Not the fear of losing money, which he had felt before and always survived, cushioned as he was by more resources than most men ever touched in a lifetime, but the fear of a man realizing the story he had told about himself for 5 years, the story he had come to believe more completely than anyone in his audience ever had. was about to be publicly, permanently, irreversibly corrected. "You'll destroy everything I built," he said quietly, and there was something almost boyish in it. A flash of the 26-year-old she'd once watched cry from exhaustion at their kitchen table, still visible somewhere underneath 51 years of accumulated armor. Noelle looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke again, there was something almost gentle threaded beneath the steel, the particular gentleness of someone who has finally, completely stopped being afraid of a person who once frightened her. "I never needed you to know what I built, Grant," she said. "I needed you to stop pretending you built what you didn't." The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence Grant could remember sitting inside during 15 years of boardroom negotiations, hostile takeovers, and difficult conversations with men far more intimidating than the woman across the table from him now. He looked at Theo. He looked at the folder he still hadn't opened. He looked, finally, back at Noelle, and something in his expression suggested that some part of him, buried beneath the shock and the fear and the wounded pride, understood that everything she'd said was true, and had probably suspected it, in some unexamined corner of his mind, for longer than he was willing to admit even now. "What happens now?" he asked, and the question came out smaller than anything he'd said since walking through the door. "Now," Noelle said, closing the folder in front of her with quiet finality, "the board reviews the evidence. And then the board decides whether the man they've trusted to lead this company is the same man who's been telling them the truth about how he built it." She stood, smoothing the front of her jacket with the same unhurried calm she'd carried into the room. At the door, she paused, and for just a moment, something almost like sympathy crossed her face. Not enough to change anything, but enough to remind him that she had once loved him in a version of both their lives that no longer existed anywhere except in memory. "For what it's worth," she said, "I hope you find something real to build next." "I mean that." Then she was gone, and Grant sat alone in the boardroom that no longer belonged to him, staring at a closed folder he still hadn't found the courage to open, understanding, for the first time in 5 years, that the woman he had dismissed as someone who didn't work had spent that entire time building something far larger, far more patient, and far more permanent than anything he had ever managed to build himself. If this story is hitting you somewhere unexpected, if you've ever had your own work quietly erased by someone else's story about themselves, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you, you're not the only person feeling this tonight. Grant didn't go home that evening. He sat in his car in the parking garage beneath his building for nearly 2 hours, engine off, watching other executives filter past his windows toward their own cars, none of them yet aware that the ground beneath the entire company had shifted that morning in a room most of them hadn't been invited into. He thought about calling his mother. He decided against it, because he already knew what Constance would say, some version of blame that would land on Noelle rather than on him, some reassurance that would let him avoid the one conversation he actually needed to have, which was with himself. He thought about calling Priya. He didn't do that either. Something about the conversation in his office that afternoon, "You're scared of her," had lodged itself somewhere he couldn't quite dislodge, and he wasn't ready to sit across from his wife and confirm that she'd been right. Instead, he opened the folder. He read it from the first page to the last, alone in his car in the dim orange light of the parking garage, and by the time he reached the final document, a wire transfer from 8 years earlier, the exact amount that had kept Calloway Industries solvent during the worst month of his career, routed through a structure so carefully built it had taken his own investigators 11 months to trace it back to its source. Something in his chest that had been rigid for as long as he could remember finally, quietly, gave way. He had spent 5 years telling a story about a self-made man. The story had never once been true, and some part of him, reading those documents alone in the dark, understood that he had always known it wasn't, in the same way a person knows a house is built on unstable ground long before the first crack appears in the wall. He put the folder in the passenger seat, started the car, and drove home to a house that no longer felt entirely like his, carrying the particular grief of a man who has just discovered that the person he underestimated most in his life was the only person who had ever actually believed in him enough to save it. The board vote was scheduled for the following Monday, And the 4 days between the meeting in the boardroom and the vote itself passed for Grant like a slow drowning, each day pulling him a little further under, each hour bringing some new confirmation that the ground he'd stood on for 15 years had never been quite as solid as he'd believed. He tried, in those 4 days, to build a defense. He called in favors from board members he'd cultivated over a decade, men who owed him for opportunities he'd handed them at exactly the right moment in their careers. 2 of them wouldn't return his calls at all. A third agreed to meet him for lunch and spent the entire hour talking about his golf handicap before finally admitting, somewhere around the check, that he'd already seen the documentation Theo Reyes had circulated. "It's thorough, Grant," the man said, not unkindly, folding his napkin with the particular care of someone avoiding eye contact. "I've never seen anything quite like it. I don't know how you come back from documentation like that." Grant didn't have an answer for him. He was beginning to understand that there wasn't one. His mother called twice a day during that stretch, each conversation circling the same well-worn grooves. Noelle had always been calculating. Noelle had clearly planned this from the very beginning. Noelle had never really loved him the way a wife should love a husband. Grant found himself, for the first time in his adult life, growing tired of his mother's voice. Something about hearing Constance rewrite the story yet again, this time to protect him from a truth he could no longer avoid, felt suddenly, unbearably exhausting. "She's not the villain in this, Mother," he said finally, on the second call of the 4th day, surprising himself as much as her. "I think I might be." Constance was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. It was the first time in Grant's memory that his mother hadn't had an immediate response ready. Priya, for her part, had grown quieter as the week went on, watching her husband unravel in a way that unsettled her more than any argument could have. She had married a man who radiated certainty, who had never once, in the 3 years she'd known him, seemed unsure of his own place in the world. Watching that certainty dissolve in real time left her with an uncomfortable question she wasn't ready to ask out loud. What exactly had she married, underneath all that confidence, if the confidence itself turned out to be borrowed? On the Saturday before the vote, desperate and cornered in the particular way that makes otherwise careful men reckless, Grant did the one thing that would prove, in the end, to be his greatest miscalculation. He called a reporter. Her name was Dana Whitcomb, a business journalist he'd cultivated a relationship with over the years, someone he'd fed exclusives to in exchange for favorable coverage during difficult quarters. He met her at a quiet restaurant 2 towns over, somewhere he was reasonably confident no one from the board would see them together, and over the course of 90 careful minutes, he told her a version of the story that placed himself, once again, at its center. "She orchestrated this whole thing out of bitterness," he told Dana, his voice steady now. Rehearsed, the confidence returning the way it always did once he had a narrative to perform rather than a truth to sit inside. A marriage that simply didn't work, and 5 years later, an elaborate scheme to punish me for it. You have to understand, Noelle was never interested in building anything of her own. This was always about revenge. Dana's story ran 2 days later, on the Monday morning of the vote itself, under a headline that Grant found, for a few hours, deeply satisfying. The scorned wife behind Calloway's boardroom coup. For almost exactly one news cycle, the narrative tilted in his favor. People love a story about a scorned woman seeking revenge. It's a simpler story to tell than the truth, which was messier, quieter, and required actually reckoning with 11 years of a man's careful, comfortable blindness. Comment sections filled with sympathy for Grant. A rival executive he'd never much liked sent him a text that reads simply, "Hang in there, brother." Noelle read the article once, standing in the kitchen of the house behind her grandmother's workshop, coffee going cold in her hand. Marisol watched her read it, tense, waiting for some reaction. Anger, hurt, the immediate need to fight back that Marisol herself would have felt in the same position. Noelle set the phone down on the counter and finished her coffee. "You're not going to respond?" Marisol asked, unable to keep the disbelief out of her voice. "Not yet," Noelle said. "He's lying about you, in a national paper, the same day as the vote. I know what he's doing." Noelle rinsed her cup in the sink, unhurried, the same calm she'd carried into the boardroom 4 days earlier. He's scared, Marisol. Scared people say things that aren't true because the truth feels like it's going to kill them. I understand that better than almost anyone. You're just going to let people believe it? Noelle looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she was thinking not just about Grant, but about 11 years of letting other people's versions of her go uncorrected, because correcting them had always seemed, at the time, like more trouble than it was worth. I'm going to let the truth catch up, she said. It always does, eventually. It's just slower than the lie in the beginning. That's the part people forget. She didn't know, standing in that kitchen, exactly how right she was about to be, or how little of the correcting she would actually have to do herself. The board vote happened that afternoon, in a room considerably more crowded than the one where Grant had first confronted Noelle 4 days earlier. Every board member had reviewed the documentation Theo Reyes had circulated. Every board member had also, by that point, read Dana Wickham's article, and the room carried a tension that hadn't been there during the quieter meeting the previous week. The tension of people trying to hold two competing stories in their heads at once and running out of time to decide which one was true. Grant made his case first, and it was, by most accounts in the room that day, the best speech of his career, measured, emotional without tipping into self-pity, an appeal to 15 years of shared history and mutual success. Several board members nodded along. For a moment, watching from her seat near the back of the room, Noelle wondered if the documentation would be enough, if a decade of goodwill and a well-delivered speech might outweigh a paper trail that told a less flattering, more complicated truth. Then Theo stood and methodically, without any of Grant's polish, without raising his voice even once, walked the board through 18 months of financial mismanagement so precisely documented that by the time he finished, the room had gone entirely silent. The particular silence of people recalculating everything they thought they understood about a man they trusted for years. The vote wasn't close. Grant lost control of Calloway Industries by a margin that would be reported the following morning as one of the more decisive boardroom defeats in the industry that year. He didn't wait for the formal announcement. He left the building the moment the count was read, walking past reporters already gathering outside with a kind of numb, mechanical composure, the last remaining performance of a man who had run out of things to perform. That evening, Dana Wickham's follow-up piece hadn't yet run. But something else had already begun, quietly, in a corner of the internet Grant hadn't thought to monitor. A post from a man named Desmond Okafor, the logistics company owner whose 40 employees had kept their jobs 3 years earlier because of an investor he'd never been able to identify. Desmond had spent the weekend reading every article about the Calloway Industries story, watching the narrative tilt against a woman he'd quietly, privately suspected for years might be the reason his company had survived. On Monday night, hours after the vote, he finally posted the message he'd been drafting and deleting for 2 days. 3 years ago, an anonymous investor kept my company alive when every bank in this city had already decided we were finished, he wrote. 40 families kept their jobs because someone I never met believed we were worth saving. I found out this weekend who that someone was. I don't know Noelle Ashby personally, but I know what she did for my employees, and it wasn't revenge. It was the opposite of revenge. It was mercy nobody asked her to give. The post had, by midnight, been shared more times than Dana Wickham's original article. Noelle was asleep when it happened, unaware that the truth had just started catching up exactly the way she told Marisol it would, faster than either of them expected, carried not by her own defense, but by the quiet testimony of people whose lives she had touched without ever needing them to know her name. She would wake the next morning to a phone full of messages, a reporter's request sitting at the top of her inbox, and the first real sign that the story the public believed about her was about to change completely. Just as a second message arrived, buried among the others, from an unknown number, containing only a single line that would take the entire story somewhere she hadn't anticipated at all. You should know Grant isn't the only one who's been keeping secrets about that 8-year-old wire transfer. Call me before you read tomorrow's paper. Noelle read the message twice before she fully understood what she was looking at, standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tile with her phone in one hand and the first light of morning just beginning to reach the workshop windows. You should know Grant isn't the only one who's been keeping secrets about that 8-year-old wire transfer. Call me before you read tomorrow's paper." She didn't recognize the number. She sat with it for a long moment, turning the phone over once in her hand, the same instinct that had served her for 5 years, telling her to be careful, to think before she reacted, to never let urgency make a decision that patience should be making instead. She called Theo first. "Trace it," she said, without preamble, the moment he picked up. "A message came in overnight. I need to know who sent it before I do anything else." "Trace what exactly?" She read it to him. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Noelle could hear him setting down whatever he'd been holding. "The wire transfer 8 years ago," Theo said slowly. "The one that stabilized Calloway Industries." "You're certain that's what they're referring to?" "That's the only 8-year-old wire transfer either of us has ever discussed publicly," Noelle said. "Theo, what aren't you telling me?" Another pause, longer this time, and when Theo finally spoke, something in his voice had changed, the careful, measured tone of a man choosing each word with unusual precision. "There's a detail in that transaction I never brought to you directly," he said, "because at the time, it didn't seem relevant to anything you needed to know. I want you to understand that before I tell you the rest." Noelle's grip tightened slightly around the phone. "Tell me anyway." "The capital that funded that rescue didn't come exclusively from Thistledown Capital," Theo said. "Roughly 40% of it came from a co-investor. Someone who insisted, at the time, on total anonymity. No name on any document, structured so even you wouldn't see it in the filings unless you went looking specifically for it. I honored that request because it was standard practice for investors who valued privacy, and because the deal needed to close within days, or Calloway Industries wouldn't have survived the week. I didn't think it mattered who they were. I still don't know if it matters." "Who was it, Theo?" "I don't know," he admitted. "The request for anonymity was airtight. I never learned the name behind it. I only know it came through a law firm in the city, the same firm, coincidentally, that handled your divorce settlement 5 years later." Noelle went very still. "Constance's firm," she said quietly. "I can't confirm that," Theo said. "But I can't rule it out either. And now someone with knowledge of that transaction is reaching out to you directly, the same week the entire story becomes public. That's not a coincidence I'm comfortable with, Noelle." Neither was she. She thought about Constance Calloway. 11 years of quiet condescension. The woman who had told her to leave with dignity, as though dignity were a consolation prize handed out to women who'd already lost everything that mattered. She tried to imagine Constance secretly funding a rescue of her own son's company without his knowledge, and found, to her own surprise, that the image didn't seem as implausible as it should have. "Call the number back," Theo said, carefully, on a line that can't be traced to Ashby Group. "I don't like this, but I like not knowing even less. If this story is stirring something up for you, if you've ever discovered a secret that made you question everything you thought you understood about your own family, let me know in the comments. I read every one, and I promise you, the story's not done complicating itself yet." Noelle called the number back from a burner phone Theo had couriered to the workshop within the hour, sitting alone at the kitchen table where her grandmother used to do the household accounts by lamplight, the blue fabric visible through the doorway to the workshop beyond. The voice that answered was a woman's, older, careful, with the particular formality of someone reading from prepared notes rather than speaking freely. "Ms. Ashby, thank you for calling. Who is this? My name isn't important yet. What's important is that you understand the full history of that transaction before tomorrow's article runs, because I don't believe you currently have the complete picture, and I think you deserve it before the rest of the world gets a version of it filtered through a reporter who doesn't understand what she's looking at." "What article?" "Dana Whitcomb has been investigating the source of that 8-year-old rescue for 3 days, the woman said. She's identified Thistledown Capital's involvement. That part, of course, is now public knowledge, thanks to the board proceedings. What she hasn't identified yet, but is close to finding, is the co-investor. If she publishes before you understand who that was and why they were involved, I believe the story she tells will hurt you, Ms. Ashby." Significantly, Noelle's pulse had picked up, though her voice remained level. "You still haven't told me who you are." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Noelle wondered if the call had dropped. "I was Grant's father's attorney," the woman finally said. "Before Grant's father died, and long before Constance took over managing the family's private holdings. I handled a great many transactions for that family that Constance would prefer stayed buried, including one, 8 years ago, that she structured entirely without her son's knowledge, using money that technically, under a trust established before Grant was even born, should have gone to Grant directly rather than being routed through his mother's discretion." Noelle felt something cold move through her chest. "Constance funded the rescue." "Constance funded 40% of it," the woman corrected, "using money that wasn't fully hers to control. And she did it, from what I understood at the time, not out of love for her son, but because she'd made a private assessment that you, not Grant, were the one actually capable of saving the company, and she was willing to quietly bet on you rather than risk her family's fortune on her son's judgment alone. She spent 11 years treating you like an outsider in public, Ms. Ashby, while privately betting everything on the fact that you were the only one in that marriage who actually knew what she was doing." Noelle sat in complete silence for a long moment, the kitchen suddenly feeling smaller than it had a moment before, the entire architecture of the last 11 years quietly rearranging itself around a fact she had never once considered. "Why are you telling me this now?" she finally asked. "Because tomorrow, Dana Wickham is going to publish a story naming you as the sole architect of Grant's downfall, a woman who orchestrated an elaborate revenge scheme entirely on her own," the woman said. "And I don't believe that's the whole truth. I think Constance Calloway has been managing this family's fortune and its secrets far more actively than anyone outside her lawyers has ever understood. I think she's about to let you take full public blame for a plan she was quietly involved in from the very beginning. And frankly, Ms. Ashby, after 11 years of watching that family, I think it's time someone stopped protecting her." The line went quiet. "Why should I trust you?" Noelle asked. "You shouldn't." "Not entirely," the woman said. "But I'd suggest you look into a company called Harrow Bridge Holdings before you decide. It's the entity that supplied that 40%. It's controlled by a trust that only 2 living people have signing authority over." "Constance is one," Noelle said slowly. "Constance is one," the woman confirmed. "The other might surprise you rather more." The line went dead before Noelle could ask the question that had already formed, cold and urgent, at the back of her throat, because there was only one other person alive who had ever had reason to want Grant to survive that crisis badly enough to secretly fund it. And it wasn't a name Noelle had considered even once in 5 years of building this story in her head. She looked up to find Marisol standing in the doorway, watching her with the particular stillness of someone who has just walked into the middle of something enormous and doesn't yet understand its shape. "Who was that?" Marisol asked. Noelle looked down at the burner phone in her hand, then out toward the workshop, where the blue fabric still hung unfinished on the wall, and felt, for the first time in 5 years, the unfamiliar sensation of not knowing what came next in a story she believed. Until this morning, she had written entirely herself. "I don't know yet," she said quietly, "but I think there's a second signature on that trust, Marisol. And if I'm right about who it is, everything I thought I understood about why my marriage ended is about to fall apart." Noelle didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the burner phone in front of her, untouched, while Theo worked through a secure line from 3 states away, quietly pulling every public filing associated with Harrow Bridge Holdings that existed. By 2 in the morning, he called her back with what little he'd found. "It's a trust," he said, "established almost 30 years ago, long before you and Grant ever met. 2 signatories, exactly as she said. Constance Calloway is one. The other signatory is listed only by initials in the earliest filings, EC. Grant's middle name is Edmund," Noelle said slowly, "after his father. His father's name was Edmund Calloway," Theo confirmed. "According to every public record, including Grant's own statements to the press over the years, died of a heart attack 14 years ago. Except," he paused, and she could hear him scrolling through something on his end. "Except Harrow Bridge Holdings filed an updated signatory disclosure 4 years ago. Not 30 years ago. For years ago, Noelle." Someone with the initials EC reconfirmed their signing authority on that trust 4 years after Edmund Calloway supposedly died. Noelle sat very still, the workshop dark and silent around her. The only light, the pale glow of her laptop screen. "He's alive," she said quietly. "I don't know that yet. It could be someone else with the same initials. It could be a clerical continuation nobody bothered to update after his death. I'm not going to tell you something is true when I only have a filing date and a coincidence." Theo's voice was careful, the tone of a man who had learned, over 5 years of working with her, that Noelle did better with uncertainty stated plainly than with false comfort. "But I think you need to consider the possibility that Edmund Calloway did not die 14 years ago. And if he's the one who quietly funded 40% of that rescue, alongside his ex-wife, without Grant ever knowing either of them was involved, then someone in that family has been managing a secret far larger than anything Grant has been hiding from you." Noelle closed her eyes. She thought of Grant at 28, telling her once, in the early years when he still told her things, about his father, a hard, distant man who had walked out on the family when Grant was 19, cutting off contact so completely that Grant had learned about his supposed death from a lawyer's letter rather than a phone call. Grant had cried about it exactly once, the night the letter arrived, and never mentioned his father again in 11 years of marriage. Noelle had assumed, the way she assumed most things about Grant's family, that the silence meant the wound had simply closed over. It hadn't closed. It had been quietly, carefully managed by 2 people who had apparently never stopped watching their son's life from a distance he didn't know existed. "If Edmund Calloway is alive," Noelle said slowly, working through out loud, "and if he and Constance have been secretly involved in Grant's business for years without his knowledge, then the story Dana Wickham is about to publish isn't the real story at all. The real story isn't that I orchestrated a takeover out of bitterness. The real story is that Grant has spent his entire adult life being quietly managed by people who never told him the truth about anything. His father's death, his company's survival, probably things neither of us has even found yet." "That's a significant claim to make without proof," Theo said. "I know." Noelle opened her eyes and looked toward the workshop, toward the blue fabric hanging in the dark. "Which is why I'm not going to make it publicly. Not yet. I'm going to find Edmund Calloway first. If this story has you sitting up a little straighter tonight, wondering what secret in your own family might still be waiting to surface, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we are nowhere near finished uncovering what this family has been hiding, and I promise you, the next reveal is bigger than this one." Dana Wickham's article ran the next morning exactly as the anonymous caller had predicted, a follow-up piece painting Noelle as the sole architect of an elaborate, years-long scheme, framing Grant's downfall as the calculated result of a woman who had never forgiven him for the divorce. The headline was worse than the first, the 5-year revenge plot nobody saw coming. For the first hour after it went live, Noelle didn't respond, exactly as she told Marisol she wouldn't. But by mid-morning, something Noelle hadn't anticipated happened entirely without her involvement. Desmond Okafor's post from 2 nights earlier had already been circulating. Now a second voice joined it, a young entrepreneur named Priya Adeyemi. No relation, Noelle noted grimly, to Grant's wife, an unfortunate coincidence that would cause minor confusion in the press for the next several days, who had received quiet, anonymous seed funding 4 years earlier for a small bakery that had since grown into a regional chain employing over 60 people. She posted a long, unpolished thread about the funding, about the one strange condition attached to it, that she mentored 2 other women trying to start something of their own, and about learning, only that week, whose name was actually behind the investment. "I keep seeing headlines calling this woman vindictive," she wrote. "I don't know anything about her marriage. I know that 4 years ago, someone believed in a 26-year-old with a business plan and no collateral, when every bank in this city had already said no to me twice. That's not revenge. I don't know what you call it, but it's not that." By early afternoon, Marisol had joined in, not defending Noelle directly, but posting a photograph of the workshop of the sewing machines and laptops sharing the same worn tables, with a caption that would end up quoted in 3 separate news outlets by the end of the week. "Everyone keeps asking who Noelle Ashby became," Marisol wrote. Nobody's asking how many of us became something because she believed in us first when nobody was watching. The post spread faster than either of Dana Wickham's articles combined. By evening, a producer from a national morning show had reached out requesting an interview, and the tenor of the coverage had begun, visibly, to shift, not because Noelle had said a single word in her own defense, but because the people whose lives she had quietly touched over 5 years had started speaking for her, one unpolished, unpaid testimony at a time. Exactly the way she told Marisol the truth would eventually catch up. But Noelle wasn't paying close attention to any of it that evening. She was 3 states away, sitting in a rental car outside a modest brick house on a quiet street, working up the nerve to knock on a door behind which, according to 2 days of careful, discreet investigation by a private researcher Theo trusted completely, a man the world believed had died 14 years ago was very much, quietly, alive. She had rehearsed nothing. She had no plan for what she would say if the man who answered the door turned out to be exactly who she suspected. She only knew that somewhere behind that door was the answer to a question that had been sitting underneath her entire marriage for 11 years, unexamined, waiting, and that Grant, wherever he was tonight, absorbing the collapse of everything he'd built, had no idea this door existed at all. She got out of the car. She walked up the short brick path, past a garden that someone clearly tended with real care, and knocked. Footsteps approached from inside, slow, unhurried, the particular pace of someone who had stopped being in a rush a long time ago. The door opened. The man standing in the doorway was older than she'd expected, silver-haired, thinner than the photographs she'd seen from decades earlier, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The same set of the jaw she'd looked at across a breakfast table for 11 years. The same eyes she'd watched narrow with fear the week his company nearly collapsed. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he had been expecting this exact visit for longer than she could have guessed. "You must be Noelle," Edmund Calloway said quietly. "I've been wondering when you'd figure it out. Took you longer than I expected, honestly. Come in. I think it's time somebody finally told you the truth about this family. All of it this time, not just the parts that were convenient for Constance to let you believe." The house smelled like wood smoke and old paper, and Edmund Calloway moved through it with the careful economy of a man who had spent years learning to live without needing very much. He led Noelle into a small study lined with books, gestured her toward a worn armchair by the window, and lowered himself into the chair across from her with the slow deliberateness of someone whose body had started keeping its own counsel about what it would and wouldn't do anymore. "I imagine you have a great many questions," he said. "I'll try to answer them in an order that makes sense, rather than the order you'd probably ask them in, if that's all right. It's easier for me to tell it the way it happened." Noelle nodded, saying nothing, letting the silence do the work it had always done best for her. "I didn't die 14 years ago," Edmund said. "I imagine you've already worked that out. What I did was leave, completely deliberately, in a way designed to look as final as possible, because at the time, it was the only way I knew to stop doing damage to my son." "Damage," Noelle repeated. "I was not a good father, Ms. Ashby. I want to be precise about that, because I've spent 14 years being careful with the truth in a way I wasn't careful with it while I was still in Grant's life. I drank. I disappeared for weeks at a time. When I was present, I was critical in the specific, corrosive way that teaches a child his worth is always conditional on his next achievement. Grant grew up believing that love was something you earned through winning, because that was the only kind of love I ever offered him." He paused, looking out the window at the garden Noelle had noticed on her way in. "When I finally got sober, 19 years too late to matter for the man Grant had already become, I understood that the kindest thing I could do for my son was disappear completely. Not slowly fade out. Disappear. Let him build a story about a father who died, rather than one who simply couldn't stop hurting him while still alive. So you faked your death. I arranged a death that wasn't technically a lie, exactly, in the paperwork. A complicated legal fiction Constance's lawyers constructed, involving a genuine medical event I survived that everyone else believed I hadn't. It's not something I'm proud of. I've had 14 years to sit with whether it was the right decision, and I still don't have a clean answer." He looked back at her, but I never stopped watching. Constance and I had been divorced for 6 years by then, and we never spoke about anything else, but we agreed, without much discussion, that we would both keep watching Grant from a distance, and that if he ever got close enough to real danger, we would step in quietly, without ever letting him know we were there. The wire transfer, Noelle said. 8 years ago, Grant was about to lose everything he'd built, and I understood, watching from a distance closer than he ever knew, that the collapse wasn't really about the market or the lawsuit. It was about the fact that he'd started believing his own myth completely, that he'd stopped listening to the one person in his life who actually understood what she was doing. Edmund's eyes were steady on hers now. You, Ms. Ashby. Constance and I funded that rescue together because we both recognized, independently of each other, that the company would only survive if it survived long enough for Grant to eventually understand what he had in you. We thought, foolishly, that giving him more time would give him more time to see it. He never saw it, Noelle said quietly. He divorced me 18 months later and married a woman half my age and told the entire world he built his company alone. Something that looked genuinely like grief moved across Edmund's face. I know. Constance and I have spent 5 years disagreeing bitterly about what to do with that knowledge. She wanted to keep protecting him from the truth about his own blindness. I believed, for longer than I've told her, that protecting him was the same mistake I made when he was a child, that the kindest thing left to offer him now isn't more shielding. It's the truth, finally, delivered by someone who loves him enough to let it hurt. Is that why you called me? Edmund's expression shifted, surprised. I didn't call you. Noelle went very still. Then who? Constance doesn't know I'm alive is common knowledge among people close to us. But I've had exactly one other confidant these past 14 years. Edmund's voice had gone quiet, careful. Someone Constance trusted enough to bring in when the legal structure around the trust needed managing day to day. If someone called you about that wire transfer and directed you toward Harrow Bridge Holdings, Ms. Ashby, I want to know who else has known about this the whole time, because it would mean Constance's own attorney went behind her back to bring you here. And I can only think of one reason a person that careful would take that risk this late in the story. He reached for a framed photograph on the small table beside his chair, one Noelle hadn't noticed until that moment, and turned it toward her. It was a photograph of a much younger Constance, standing beside a woman Noelle recognized instantly, though it took a full second for her mind to process what she was looking at, because the woman in the photograph, 30 years younger, unmistakably the same voice Noelle had spoken to on the burner phone the night before, was Odessa Ashby. Her grandmother. Noelle's hands had gone cold. That's not possible. Your grandmother and Constance Calloway were close friends for almost 40 years, Edmund said gently. Long before you ever met Grant. Long before either family had any reason to think their lives would intersect the way they eventually did. Odessa managed Constance's private legal affairs quietly for decades. Off the books, the same way you'd later manage your own fortune off the books, which I suspect is not a coincidence. Ms. Ashby, but a lesson passed down without either of you ever discussing it directly. He set the photograph back down carefully. Your grandmother has known who your husband's family really was since before you ever brought him home for the first time. I believe she's been the one voice, quietly for over a decade, arguing that someone in this story needed to finally tell you the truth. Noelle sat in the small, book-lined study with the fading afternoon light coming through the window and felt the entire architecture of the last 11 years shift beneath her one final time. Because her grandmother, the woman who had taught her patience in a workshop 3 states away, who had died 4 years before Noelle ever built her first quiet investment, had somehow been threading through this story from a distance even Noelle had never suspected, tying together 2 families who would eventually, improbably, become one. She's been dead for 4 years, Noelle said quietly. How could she have called me last night? Edmund's expression softened into something almost like a smile. She didn't, Ms. Ashby. I imagine that call came from the one person your grandmother trained to carry on exactly this kind of careful, quiet work after she was gone. Someone who's been managing Harrow Bridge Holdings' legal filings for the last 4 years without either you or Grant ever noticing her name on a single document. He watched Noelle's face carefully as the realization arrived, slow, and complete, and something in his expression suggested he already knew exactly whose name she was about to say. "Theo," Noelle whispered. "I believe," Edmund said quietly, "you have a great deal to discuss with him." Noelle didn't remember the drive back to the workshop. She remembered the brick house getting smaller in the rearview mirror, and she remembered, at some point on the highway, pulling over onto the shoulder because her hands had started shaking too badly to keep the car steady, and sitting there for 20 minutes with the hazard lights ticking while she tried to make the last 4 years of her life fit into a new shape. Theo had found her, not the other way around, as she believed for 4 years, that she'd hired a promising young strategist through a mutual contact, a fortunate accident that had built the foundation of everything she'd become. Theo had found her, carefully, deliberately, in the exact window after her grandmother's death when Noelle had been most alone, most in need of someone she could trust completely, and he had let her believe the timing was coincidence. She called him from the shoulder of the highway, phone shaking slightly in her hand. He picked up on the second ring. "Noelle, is everything all right? You sound—" "Did you know," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, "that my grandmother and Constance Calloway were friends for 40 years? The silence on the other end of the line lasted just long enough to confirm everything. "I did," Theo said finally quietly. "I've known since before you hired me." "Since before I hired you," Noelle repeated, "or since before you found me." Another silence. When Theo spoke again, his voice had lost the careful, measured quality she'd always associated with him, replaced by something rawer, something that sounded, for the first time in 4 years, genuinely uncertain. "Odessa came to me 8 months before she died," he said. "She'd been managing Constance's private affairs for decades, off the books, the same way she used to manage half the accounts for the businesses in that town who couldn't afford real lawyers. She knew things about the Calloway family that Constance herself had only shared with one other living person. And she told me, very plainly, that she was dying and that she was worried about you, about a granddaughter she believed had married into a family whose secrets ran deeper than her own marriage's ending would ever reveal to her on its own. So she recruited you. She asked me to watch out for you. That's the phrase she used. She didn't ask me to manipulate you, Noelle, and I want you to understand the distinction, even if I recognize it might not feel like a meaningful one right now. Everything I built with you, every deal, every late night, at that kitchen table, all of it was real. I never once directed a decision that wasn't genuinely, entirely yours." His voice caught slightly. "But I let you believe I found you by accident. And I let that lie sit underneath 4 years of real trust, because I was afraid that if I told you the truth, you'd never be able to separate what was real about our work together from what your grandmother had set in motion before either of us met." Noelle sat on the highway shoulder, cars passing in a steady rush beside her, and felt something complicated settle into place. Not quite anger, not quite gratitude, but some difficult combination of both that she suspected would take much longer than one phone call to fully sort through. "Why didn't she just tell me herself?" Noelle asked, "before she died. Why all of this? The anonymous calls, the careful distance, for years of you not saying anything." "Because she knew you," Theo said simply. "She knew that if she told you directly, 'Here's a family secret. Here's a fortune you should quietly build. Here's a network already half in place,' you'd have rejected all of it out of pride. You needed to believe you were building something entirely your own, out of nothing, the same way you'd need to believe it now, if I'm being honest with you. She loved you enough to give you the version of this story that would actually let you become who you needed to become, rather than the version that would have been easier to explain." A pause. "I think, in her own way, she was teaching you the same lesson she spent 40 years teaching Constance. That real power doesn't announce itself. It just quietly makes sure the people who deserve to survive, survive." If this story has you thinking about the quiet architects in your own life, the people who shaped your path without you ever fully realizing it until much later, let me know in the comments. I read every one, and I promise we are getting close to the truth this whole story has been circling. Noelle sat on that highway shoulder for a long time after the call ended, watching the lights shift toward evening, thinking about a grandmother she believed she understood completely, A woman who had apparently spent the last decade of her life quietly ensuring her granddaughter would survive a marriage Odessa must have suspected, from the very beginning, would eventually collapse. She thought about the blue fabric hanging unfinished on the workshop wall. Fabric Odessa had never explained, never told anyone what it was meant to become. Noelle wondered for the first time if her grandmother had simply run out of time to finish it, or if some part of the old woman had understood that unfinished things sometimes matter more than completed ones, that leaving a thread untied could be its own kind of inheritance. She drove the rest of the way home in silence, and when she finally walked back into the workshop that night, Marisol was waiting for her at the kitchen table, having clearly been waiting for hours, a worried expression on her face that softened the moment she saw Noelle. "You look like you found something big," Marisol said carefully. Noelle sat down across from her, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical hours of the day. "I found out my whole life has been quietly managed by people who loved me more than I understood," she said. "And I'm still trying to decide if that makes me feel less like the person I thought I'd built myself into, or more like her." Her who? Noelle looked toward the workshop doorway, toward the sewing machine that had once belonged to a woman who, it turned out, had been playing a longer, quieter game than anyone in either family had ever suspected. "My grandmother," she said. "I think I need to finally finish something she left behind." She stood, walked in the workshop, and for the first time in 5 years, lifted the length of blue fabric down from the wall where it had hung, untouched, since the week she'd first swept the dust out of that room. There was a note pinned to the underside of the fabric, folded small, yellowed slightly with age. Noelle's hands trembled as she unpinned it and unfolded the paper. And there, in her grandmother's familiar, careful handwriting, was a single sentence that would end up meaning more to her than almost anything else in this entire story. "For whichever one of you finally has the courage to ask the right questions, Constance or Noelle, whoever finds this first, the truth was never something either of you needed protecting from. It was something you both needed permission to finally tell." Noelle stood in the quiet workshop for a long time, the note in one hand and the unfinished fabric in the other, understanding finally that the story she had spent 5 years believing was entirely her own creation had actually begun decades before she was born, in a friendship between two women who had understood, long before either of their families did, that real strength was never about hiding the truth. It was about knowing exactly when the time had come to finally let it be told. Constance Calloway had not slept properly in 3 days, and by the time her private line rang at 11 that night, she had already begun to suspect what the call would be about, in the particular way a person senses a storm before the sky actually breaks. "He told her," Constance said, before the voice on the other end had spoken a single word. "Edmund told her, didn't he?" "She came to him," the voice said. It belonged to a woman named Harriet Voss. No relation to anyone in this story who mattered, simply a family attorney who had inherited the Calloway account from a retiring partner 11 years earlier and had spent every year since regretting it a little more. "I didn't send her, Constance. I want to be clear about that before you say something you'll regret." "Then who did?" Harriet hesitated, and in that hesitation, Constance understood, with the sinking clarity of a woman who has spent decades anticipating exactly this kind of failure, precisely who had made the call. "Odessa left instructions," Harriet said quietly, "before she died. A contingency triggered automatically if Noelle's company ever became large enough to trigger certain disclosure thresholds on Harrow Bridge Holdings. It wasn't a decision anyone made recently, Constance. It was a decision your friend made years ago and built to execute itself whether any of us wanted it to or not." Constance sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, the phone pressed hard against her ear, feeling the particular vertigo of discovering that a woman she had trusted completely for 40 years had, in her final act of friendship, taken a decision entirely out of her hands. "She promised me," Constance said, and her voice, for the first time in longer than she could remember, cracked audibly. "She promised me she'd let it stay buried until I was ready." "I don't think she believed you were ever going to be ready," Harriet said, not unkindly. "I think she loved you enough to stop waiting for permission you were never going to give her." Constance closed her eyes. Somewhere across the country, in a house she hadn't visited in 14 years, her ex-husband was very likely sitting with the granddaughter of the only person who had ever truly known both of them. And somewhere closer, in a penthouse he no longer had any right to call secure, her son had no idea that the ground beneath his entire understanding of his family was about to open completely. "Does Grant know yet?" Constance asked. "About any of it?" "Not yet," Harriet said. "But Dana Whitcomb called my office an hour ago, asking about a company called Harrow Bridge Holdings. She's not asking about Noelle anymore, Constance. She's asking about the trust itself. If she pulls the signatory history the way she's pulled everything else this week, she's going to find Edmund's name before any of us have the chance to prepare Grant for what that means. If this story has your heart racing a little tonight, you're exactly where I want you to be. Go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't already, because I promise you, the next batch is where everything this family has been hiding finally comes into the light. And tell me in the comments, who do you think should be the one to finally tell Grant the truth about his father?" Grant was in his home office when his phone rang for the 4th time that night, and he almost didn't answer it, exhausted past the point of caring about one more reporter, one more board member calling to offer condolences that felt more like curiosity dressed up as sympathy. But the caller ID read Dana Whitcomb, and something in him, the same instinct that had made him call her in the first place for days and one entire lifetime ago, made him pick up. "I need you to answer something for me," Dana said, without preamble, her voice carrying an edge Grant hadn't heard from her before, something that sounded almost like discomfort. "And I want you to understand I'm asking because I think you deserve to hear this from me before it runs in tomorrow's paper, not because I'm trying to get a quote." "What is it? Do you know anything about a company called Harrow Bridge Holdings?" Grant frowned, turning the name over. It meant nothing to him. "No." "What?" There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Grant felt something cold settle low in his stomach, the particular dread of a man who has spent a week discovering that everything he believed about his own life was smaller and less true than the reality underneath it. "It's the entity that supplied 40% of the rescue capital 8 years ago," Dana said carefully. "The same rescue that Noelle Ashby's company financed the rest of. I've spent 3 days trying to identify the second investor. I finally got a partial signatory record an hour ago." Another pause, and Grant could hear, even through the phone, that she was choosing her next words with unusual care. "Grant, I need you to sit down if you're not already sitting." "I'm sitting," he lied. He was standing in the middle of his office, phone pressed hard to his ear, his free hand braced against the edge of his desk. "The other signatory on that trust is listed under the initials EC," Dana said. "Grant, I ran it against public death records, marriage records, everything I could find. There's no clean match to your mother. There's no clean match to anyone else with those initials connected to your family." "Except my father," Grant said quietly, before she could finish, the words arriving in his mouth before his mind had fully caught up to why he was saying them. "Edmund Calloway. Your father died 14 years ago," Dana said, gently, the way you'd remind someone of a fact they already knew, testing whether he'd correct her. Grant said nothing, because somewhere underneath the shock, in a part of himself he rarely let anyone see, some old and buried instinct was already telling him that 14 years ago, he had received a letter about his father's death and never once been permitted to see a body, never once been allowed to attend a service beyond a small, closed gathering his mother had insisted was what Edmund would have wanted, never once questioned why his mother had handled every single detail of the arrangements herself, alone, refusing help from anyone. "I need to call you back," Grant said, and hung up before Dana could respond. Standing alone in his office with his hands still braced against the desk, the entire foundation of his childhood grief suddenly, sickeningly uncertain beneath him. He called his mother. It rang 4 times before she answered, and the moment he heard the particular quality of her silence on the other end of the line. Not confusion, not surprise, but the careful, dreading silence of someone who has been waiting years for exactly this call. Grant understood, with a certainty that arrived faster and more completely than any board vote or Billboard ever had, that his entire life had been built on a lie far larger than anything Noelle had done to him this week. "Mom," he said, and his voice came out smaller than he'd heard it in decades. The voice of a 19-year-old boy who'd once received a letter instead of a phone call. Is Dad alive? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Grant already had his answer before Constance finally, quietly, began to speak. That Constance's breath came unsteady through the phone, the sound of a woman working up to a sentence she had rehearsed in her head 1,000 times over 14 years and had never once expected to actually say out loud. "Sit down, Grant," she said finally. "Please. This isn't a conversation for standing up." "I'm sitting." This time it was true. He'd sunk into the chair behind his desk without noticing himself do it, his legs simply giving out beneath the weight of the question he'd already asked and the answer he already knew was coming. "Your father is alive," Constance said. The words landed exactly the way Grant had known they would, and somehow still managed to knock the air out of him completely. He sat in the silence of his office, phone pressed to his ear, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt since he was 19 years old. Not grief this time, but its strange, delayed cousin, the specific vertigo of realizing you've spent 14 years grieving something that was never actually true. "Why?" he said, and it came out as barely more than a breath. "Why would you let me believe he died? Why would you let me stand in a room with 12 people and bury a casket that—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, a new and horrifying question arriving before he could complete the first one. "Was there even anything in that casket, Mom?" "There was a genuine medical event," Constance said quietly. "He nearly died, Grant. That part was never a lie. He had a heart attack that should have killed him. And during his recovery, when the doctors weren't certain he'd survive at all, he made a decision. He asked me to help him disappear rather than continue being your father, because he understood, more clearly than I think you've ever let yourself understand, exactly how much damage he'd already done to you. That wasn't his decision to make." Grant's voice had risen, cracking now with an anger that had nowhere useful to go. "That was never his decision. You don't get to decide someone is too damaged to be told the truth about their own father, Mom. You don't get to make that call for me. I know that now," Constance said, and something in her voice broke in a way Grant had never once heard in 51 years of knowing her. Not at his father's supposed funeral, not through any crisis he could remember. "I've known it for years, and I was too much of a coward to correct it, because every year that passed made the lie feel more impossible to unravel than a year before. I told myself I was protecting you. The truth is I was protecting myself from having to watch you find out what kind of choices I was capable of making without you." Grant sat with that for a long moment, the office dark around him except for the single desk lamp, the city lights blurring slightly through the window as his eyes filled despite himself. "Where is he?" he finally asked. 3 states from here. He's been there for years, living quietly, and Grant, Constance's voice caught. "He funded part of your rescue 8 years ago, alongside Noelle. He's been watching your entire career from a distance this whole time, and so have I, and neither of us ever found the courage to tell you any of it, because by the time we might have, the lie had already gotten too large to survive the truth without destroying something. You've been managing my entire life," Grant said slowly, the full shape of it finally arriving. "The rescue, my marriage, everything. Both of you, quietly, from behind a curtain I never knew existed. Not managing," Constance said. "Watching, hoping, occasionally intervening when the alternative was watching you actually fail completely. I understand if that distinction means nothing to you right now. I'm not sure it would mean much to me either, in your position." Grant sat in silence for a long time after that, long enough that Constance finally, quietly, said his name twice before he responded. "I need to see him," Grant said finally. "I need to see my father. Tonight, if I can." "He'll want that," Constance said. "I think he's wanted it for 14 years. If you've ever discovered that the people who raised you were protecting you from a truth you actually deserve to have, go ahead and share this story with someone who might need to hear it tonight, and let me know in the comments how you'd have reacted in Grant's place." Grant didn't call ahead. He drove through the night, 3 states in 11 hours, stopping only twice for gas and coffee he didn't drink, running through 14 years of memory that he now understood had been built on a foundation that never actually existed. He thought about the letter. He thought about the closed casket, the small gathering, his mother's insistence on handling every detail alone. He thought about every milestone since, every deal closed, every award accepted, every quiet moment he'd wished, in some buried corner of himself, that his father could have seen, and understood now that his father had, in fact, seen almost all of it, from somewhere close enough to matter and far enough to remain hidden. He arrived at the brick house just after dawn, the same modest street Noelle had parked on 2 days earlier, the same tinted garden visible in the pale early light. He sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes before he found the nerve to get out, and when he finally knocked, the door opened almost immediately, as though the man on the other side had been standing there, waiting for longer than made any reasonable sense. Edmund Calloway looked at his son for a long moment, and something in his weathered face moved through several emotions at once. Fear, hope, a grief so old it had calcified into something almost unrecognizable as grief anymore. "Grant," he said quietly. Grant stood on the doorstep, 51 years old, a man who had built and lost an empire in the space of a single week, and felt, for the first time since he was 19, entirely unable to speak. "I know you have questions," Edmund said, stepping back to let his son inside. "I've had 14 years to prepare answers I'm still not certain will be good enough. But I'd rather try, badly, than let you stand on that step a moment longer believing I don't owe you every single one of them." Grant walked inside, and the door closed quietly behind him, and for the next 6 hours, in a small book-lined study that smelled like wood smoke and old paper, a father and son who had lost 14 years to a lie neither of them had chosen finally, slowly, painfully, began the work of learning who the other one had actually become. Noelle heard about Grant's disappearance from Dana Whitcomb, of all people, who called her directly the following afternoon with a question rather than an accusation for the first time in the entire ordeal. "He didn't show up for the emergency press conference his PR team scheduled," Dana said. "Nobody's heard from him in almost 18 hours. His assistant says his car's gone. I know you two aren't exactly close right now, but I thought you might know something the rest of us don't." Noelle knew exactly where he'd gone, though she hadn't been the one to send him there. She sat with the knowledge for a long moment, feeling the strange, unfamiliar pull of concern for a man she had spent a difficult week formally, publicly dismantling. "I think he found his father," she said finally. There was a long pause on Dana's end. "His father died 14 years ago." "I don't think that's true anymore," Noelle said. "I think you should hold off on running anything else until you understand the whole story, Dana. This isn't the revenge plot you wrote about. It never was. I'd like to actually explain it to you properly, if you're willing to listen without a deadline hanging over the conversation." Dana was quiet for a moment. "You give me the real story?" "I'd give you the true one," Noelle said. "I can't promise it'll be simpler than the one you already ran. It's a great deal more complicated than a scorned wife getting even. But it's the truth, and I think, after everything, that matters more right now than a clean headline." They met the next morning at the workshop, Dana arriving with a notebook rather than a recorder, an unusual choice for a journalist that Noelle noted and appreciated. For nearly 3 hours, Noelle told her everything. The 11 years of invisible work, the 5 quiet years of building Ashby Group brick by patient brick, the wire transfer, Edmund Constance, her grandmother's decades-long friendship with a woman she'd never once suspected was connected to any of it. Dana listened without interrupting, filling page after page of her notebook, and when Noelle finally finished, the older woman sat back in her chair with an expression that looked less like a journalist chasing a story and more like a person who had just watched an entire narrative she'd helped construct quietly dissolve. "I owe you a correction," Dana said finally. "A real one. Not a small clarification buried on page 9. "I don't need a correction," Noelle said. "I need the truth told accurately, once, and then I'd like to go back to running my company and rebuilding this workshop without a camera crew parked outside it every morning." Dana's piece ran 3 days later under a headline that would end up being quoted, cited, and referenced for years afterward in business schools studying the case. The truth about Noelle Ashby and the family that spent 30 years quietly protecting each other from it. It told the whole story carefully, without sensationalism, and by the time it published, the public narrative Noelle had spent a week absorbing without defending herself had finally, completely turned. If this story has taught you anything about the danger of believing the first version of events you're handed, that's exactly why I tell stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments, had a rush judgment about someone ever cost you the real story later? Grant returned home 9 days after he'd left, quieter than anyone who knew him had ever seen him, carrying a version of himself that had clearly been rebuilt from somewhere much further down than the boardroom defeat that started this entire unraveling. He asked to see Noelle before he did anything else, before he faced Priya, before he addressed the board, before he read a single one of the dozens of messages waiting for him. He drove to the workshop unannounced, the way she once had to his father's door, and found her in the yard behind the building, hanging fabric out to air in the late afternoon sun. She saw him before he reached the gate and didn't look surprised. "I met my father," Grant said, standing awkwardly at the edge of the yard, a man who had spent his entire adult life commanding rooms and now, visibly, didn't know what to do with his hands. "I know about the trust. I know what he and my mother did 8 years ago to save the company I told the world I'd built alone." "I know," Noelle said. "I was the one who found him first, Grant. I know that too." He took a step closer, then stopped himself, as though some new humility had taught him, finally, to wait for permission rather than assuming it. "I came to say I'm sorry. Not the way I apologized in that boardroom. Not some careful performance of it. I mean it the way I should have meant it 11 years ago, when I stood in a room full of investors and told them my wife didn't work." His voice caught. "You built an entire empire while I was busy building a story about myself that wasn't true. And I let my mother and my father quietly manage the wreckage every time it nearly fell apart. And I never once thought to ask why the wreckage kept somehow surviving. I was the least curious man in my own life, Noelle. I understand that now." Noelle set down the fabric she was holding and looked at him for a long moment. This man she had once loved completely, who had hurt her in ways both loud and quiet, who was standing in front of her now stripped of every certainty he'd ever carried. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right," she said finally. "It isn't, and I don't think pretending otherwise would do either of us any good. But I don't hate you, Grant. I stopped hating you somewhere around year 3, when I realized the hate was taking up space I needed for building something better. What I feel now is something closer to relief, that the truth finally caught up, that neither of us has to carry the weight of pretending anymore." "What happens now?" Grant asked, and it was the same small, uncertain question he'd asked her in the boardroom, though this time it carried none of the fear, only a kind of genuine, exhausted curiosity. "Now you figure out who you are when nobody's applauding you," Noelle said. "I did. It took me most of 5 years, and it was the hardest and most honest work I've ever done. I think it might be good for you, too." Grant nodded slowly, and for a moment, standing in the golden light of the workshop yard, something passed between them that looked less like the end of a love story and more like the beginning of a real, if difficult, peace. "Thank you," he said, "for not destroying me completely, when you had every right to." "I never wanted to destroy you," Noelle said. "I only ever wanted you to see me. It just turned out that seeing me required losing almost everything else first." Priya left him within the month, not out of cruelty, but out of the same clear-eyed practicality that had once made her useful to him. She had married a certain version of a man, and that man, it turned out, had never fully existed. She moved to the coast, started her own consulting firm, and would later tell a mutual friend that she didn't regret the marriage. Only the years she'd spent believing certainty was the same thing as character. Grant sold his remaining stake in what had once been Calloway Industries 18 months later, using the proceeds to start something smaller, slower, built this time on foundations he understood completely because he had, for once, laid every single one of them himself. He visited his father every few weeks. The visits were awkward at first, then less so, then, eventually, something that looked almost like the relationship they might have had if 14 years hadn't been lost to a lie neither of them had chosen. Constance never fully repaired her relationship with Noelle, though something like mutual respect eventually grew in the space where hostility had once lived. She spent her final years, by her own quiet admission, trying to become the kind of person her old friend Odessa had always privately believed she could be. Noelle didn't return to the spotlight. Ashby Group continued to grow quietly under Theo's careful management, but Noelle herself spent most of her days at the workshop, which had grown by then into a full training center, graduating dozens of young women a year into businesses of their own. Marisol ran it almost entirely on her own by the third year, and Noelle liked, more than almost anything else in her life, watching a girl who had once found an error in a stack of invoices in 90 seconds become someone capable of building something lasting entirely on her own terms. One evening, nearly 2 years after the Billboard first appeared on Fifth Avenue, Noelle finally finished the length of blue fabric her grandmother had left unfinished on the workshop wall. It became, in the end, a simple quilt patched together from scraps of every project the workshop had produced in its first 2 years. A tailoring student's first successful dress, a swatch from Marisol's earliest sewing lesson, a corner of the fabric Odessa herself had never gotten to use. Noelle hung it in the front room of the workshop, where every new student would see it on their first day, and she never explained exactly what it meant. She simply let people ask when they were ready, the way her grandmother had once let her ask questions in her own time, at her own pace, when she finally had the courage to want the answers. Kesserie. No, Marisol. Noelle corrected herself with a small private smile whenever the old draft name surfaced in her memory, a joke she'd never quite explained to anyone. Asked her about it one final time, years later, sweeping the workshop floor closing. "You own a fortune most people can't imagine," Marisol said. "You could be anywhere in the world tonight. Why are you still here, sweeping floors with me?" Noelle looked around the workshop, at the machines, at the quilt on the wall, at the life she had built not out of revenge, but out of the patient, unglamorous work of finally becoming entirely her own. "Because this is where I learned that the truth doesn't need to be loud to matter," she said. "It just needs enough time and enough people willing to finally tell it." She turned off the lights, and the two of them walked out together into the quiet evening, leaving the workshop dark behind them. The quilt on the wall, the only thing still catching the last light through the window, a story finally finished, thread by careful thread, exactly the way it was always meant to be told. If there's one thing worth carrying with you from Noelle's story, let it be this: the truth doesn't disappear just because it's buried. It waits patiently for someone brave enough to finally dig it up. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, subscribe for the next one, and tell me in the comments, what's the biggest lesson you're taking from this story?